So in terms of the concept of whole of society, whole of government approach to responding to a multifactorial, multisectoral problem caused by this pandemic, one of the major lessons learned that we have somehow drawn reference from our 2002, 2003 SARS experience and now to this a much more wide-scale effect of COVID-19 pandemic is really the need to identify in operational terms and operational context how each sector, whether they be health or non-health sector, would be able to determine its specific role and its specific entry points of coordination and cooperation in a regional response. Much of the ASEAN member states and other countries, they already have this national pandemic preparedness and response framework that is being led by the respective national disaster management offices, no? With the different terminologies and different names for each country. But if we would scale this up to the regional response level, we are still wanting in terms of really having a concrete operational regional structure of coordination and response, meaning there is really a harmonized, collective, and synergistic sectoral response from various countries contributing to region-wide efforts. We have seen somehow some lessons in terms of our disaster management and humanitarian assistance. But much of the concerns and effects and impacts of COVID-19 goes beyond health, and not only health, but also goes beyond, as what we have discussed here, economic impacts. But then, in responding to COVID-19 as a pandemic, is not the sole function of one sector, economic or foreign affairs, or even the health sector. There is a need to really determine and agree on a region-wide framework of cooperation and coordination. And what I'm talking about is operational terms, operational frameworks and mechanisms, not only based on agreed statements or agreed commitments, but also translating this to feasible, doable, and actionable initiatives. Over to you.
Well, currently, there is a plan to have an ASEAN, I can't remember whether you mentioned this or not, an ASEAN Coordinating Center for Animal Health and Zoonosis, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And an agreement was established for this center to be signed by all ASEAN countries in 2016. But the final ratification of Indonesia is still pending. So because of that, this center hasn't quite been set up. Do you know? Can you share this one?
Yes, definitely. There is this center which is looking into the animal health sector side, or the zoonosis center. And definitely the implementation of this center is not yet in force, meaning the functions of the center is not yet fully operational or enforced, simply because of certain ratification-related processes. But then beyond this center, you also have to because this is just the animal health sector, the center that would deal with zoonosis. But then beyond the animal health sector, you also have to consider the public health emergencies that would involve the human population. And for this one, we already have this ASEAN Emergency Operations Center network. Each of the ASEAN member states, they have their own public health emergency operations center based on the international health regulation, supported, followed through by WHO. But then when we talk about regional mechanisms of engagement that would involve the dialogue partners countries as well as other agencies, we have this zoonotic center that is yet to be implemented, but supported by all of the dialogue partners interested within ASEAN. We also have this upcoming ASEAN type of CDC, which is the ASEAN Public Health Emergency Operations Center and Emerging Diseases. The feasibility study of this is ongoing from June to October of this year and very much supported by Japan. And in the cost of this feasibility study is very high, no? And this center will complement the existing and soon to be operationalized zoonotic center. It would also complement the AHA Center. It would also complement the existing ASEAN Center for Military Medicine. So all of this, we cannot come up with various centers with different silos of engagement and initiatives. They should be coordinated in one particular framework for public health emergencies and pandemic preparedness and response. We already have this ADMIR at the level of disaster management and humanitarian assistance. But then we also have to have an overall agreement and a framework of operations with the corresponding standard operating procedures and protocols in terms of regional response. More often than not, at the regional level, it's always the health that is going to be seen as the lead. But then, as I mentioned earlier, all of the centers that I have mentioned, including the one that you have mentioned, Professor Johan, on the Zoonotic Center, needs to follow a framework of cooperation. And that framework of cooperation should be operational enough that everybody understands its function, so that we will be able to respond collectively. This is not an ideal aspiration. This is not an ideal statement or an aspiration from my part. But then we have already seen certain snippets or aspects of regional cooperation in terms of natural disasters or responses to calamities due to natural hazards. Then we just have to translate those in terms of a regional response to public health emergencies, because in pandemics, borders are closed, but then in terms of natural disaster and calamities, borders are open. But then we have to go beyond that, no, beyond borders, and determine entry points of coordination and cooperation without sacrificing economic gains, and also without sacrificing tourism or trade-related issues. Over to you.
I have one tiny little question at the end, my final one on health, and that is there any cooperation on finding a vaccine for COVID-19?
Yes, in fact, we have just discussed these matters with Thailand because Thailand is the lead country in terms of implementing this ASEAN ASEAN vaccine security and self-reliance. In fact, there is a political commitment in supporting the implementation of this. In addition to that, being led by Malaysia as well, we have this strategy on ASEAN drug security and self-reliance. So this has been in discussion since last year in terms of securing the medicines, securing medicines for lesser known diseases that all of a sudden we have a sudden outbreak, no, in some of the countries. This has been in discussion since 2018 and formalized in 2019. Might say it's fortunate that this pandemic happened because things are now being fast-tracked. And definitely, as mandated and as mentioned by our ASEAN Summit leaders, they are really looking into the implementation of this vaccine security and self-reliance so that the region will be ensured of a sufficient supply of quality vaccines and drugs targeting COVID-19. And not only quality medicines, but then affordable and readily accessible. So the regional cooperation ASEAN could be used as a leverage in terms of accessing this soon-to-be discovered vaccines. Over to you, Professor.
It's a good question. It runs the gamut, and of course, I think we're learning by doing. So to draw lessons and legacy from COVID-19, I think it's still, if I may say, still early days. We're still grappling with it. However, we still can make some observations about what we've seen, how we can maybe already draw some commonalities. It's a situation of learning by doing. I know we have the ASEAN Secretariat, but if you look at the different countries that have been afflicted by COVID-19 across the globe, across the world, it's pretty much every state for itself, every society for itself, and borders have come up, travel restrictions have been imposed. So almost in a way, you have to protect yourself. Looking at lessons, I think one way we can maybe delineate what we've learned is to compare COVID-19 with SARS. We've had a number of pandemic-like diseases and outbreaks in Southeast Asia, but SARS was a big one about 17 years ago. And that, I think partly laid the groundwork for relatively better handling in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, vis-a-vis Europe and the US. When COVID-19 struck, when it started to spread and the outbreak became a fact of life and it went around the region and around the world, I think around here, we took it very seriously very early on. Even though the different countries had different responses. In Thailand, I think the Thai government was criticized for maybe being slower to impose air travel restrictions, but nevertheless, we took it very seriously. And I think, so from SARS, you also can see, Dr. Johan, I think one long-term legacy we will see is the mask wearing, the tendency to wear masks and not shy from wearing masks. In Thailand, it's almost universal. Everywhere you go, you would feel like an alien, if, a stranger if you go to public places not wearing masks. So I think mask wearing heightened hygiene standards, the hand washing, a little bit of distancing. I think that'll be longer term, the heightened hygiene. But beyond that, I want to also answer Cheng Paul's question, alluding a little bit to the earlier question about SMEs and economies and economic impact. One danger, we've seen the different stimulus. It's not a stimulus, it's more like a stabilization packages from different countries, not just to stimulate economies, but to stabilize, to kind of show up the entire devastation from the COVID-19. The other danger, on the contrary, of not helping SMEs is the conglomerates, Dr. Johan. I mean, in Thailand, it's been seen that 1% reportedly owns like 2/3 of the country, of the economy. So the danger is that the conglomerates, the big family-owned conglomerates, a clutch of them, maybe 5 or 6, they become kind of like the business oligarchs of Thailand. The big companies get bailed out more than the SMEs. Finally, I'll just say one small point about political regimes, if I may. COVID-19 has enabled, given a pretext to states to impose all kinds of infringements on civil liberties and fundamental freedoms. We've had a lot of, directives from the government. There have been emergency, there have been lockdowns, there have been all kinds of restrictions on movement, on basic freedoms. Some of this will not be lifted right away, and maybe not for a long, long time. So we're seeing a bit of an authoritarian upsurge, authoritarian movement, if you will, where countries and regimes in our region have become a little bit more authoritarian as a result of COVID-19. This had to be done, it's understandable, But I think as COVID-19 eases, as economies and societies reopened, we would be looking for the return of those fundamental freedoms. In some countries, I think this might not happen. So in the longer term, we could see Southeast Asia becoming just a little bit more authoritarian as a result. And that would have long-term consequences, because the more authoritarian Southeast Asia is more conducive in dealing with for China to deal with. So I think this is one battleground between the China, US, and China and the West. Whether Southeast Asia becomes more authoritarian or more democratic, more open, or more repressive. And COVID-19 has enabled these governments to become more repressive.
There was a sobering thought at the end, Dr. Titinan. Let's hope that, one of the takeaways is also that people, I suppose, value their freedom and their liberties. So at some point of time, we know that some of the measures are absolutely necessary to control the disease. But at the same time, I think there is the need to understand that when things get better, the democratic processes will be back in place. I think a very, very good point. So it's an important lesson to understand. And in fact, if one carries that argument a little further, this may be a kind of lesson for us to strengthen our democratic institutions. I mean, that they're robust and they do not sort of change with time and with pandemics like COVID. So that's a very important one. We have Professor Tam, who can probably talk to the questions of economics and the takeaways from this particular crisis that we are facing now.
I think the first lesson in terms of a public health crisis is that countries really need to invest in their public health infrastructure. We find that countries with better public health infrastructure are able to better manage the spread of the pandemic. So investment in public health infrastructure is very important. The economics of it. The second is actually sharing of information is very important, because we are talking about cross-border infection, and therefore information sharing is very important to contain cross-border infection. The third is actually because countries are fearful and do not know how to handle, therefore they retreat into very protectionistic positions. So they try to restrict trade, and that actually worsens the situation for each country. So I would say that even when we have the fear of cross-border infection, it is important to keep cross-border flow of goods free, and that's to help countries as we have seen in the case of medical supplies or in the case of food. So keeping borders open for goods flow unrestricted in an unrestricted fashion is important. Early action is better than late. So it is the information sharing would help countries to take actions earlier, and that would help in terms of the spread of the disease. But in terms of the trade-off between, there's the economic trade-off between locking down to prevent the spread of the disease and the opening up of the economies, so that your economies will not deteriorate in terms of its economic situation. The trade-off between containing the disease and opening up for business, that is a difficult decision. I think all countries are still trying to have this trade-off between the cost of containment and the cost of lockdown. And that's not something that we actually know how to handle, not even in Malaysia. I think even in Malaysia, even though we say the curve is flattening, we can open up, we are not very sure whether we can continue to contain after we have opened up. So it's very much a national initiative that each country must look at it and weigh the costs and benefits of it. Yeah.
I think you're right about the individual way countries have to cope with this, because it varies from country to country. And it does appear that we don't quite know all the ramifications yet, of what COVID-19 will be on the economic front, and definitely on the political front, as we mentioned, earlier, Titinan mentioned earlier.